In 2024, the sprawling estate once owned by the legendary Tony Curtis was sold to a young couple, Evelyn and Mark, who were eager to start their new life in the iconic Beverly Hills mansion. The house had been a prized possession of Curtis, a Hollywood heartthrob of the 1950s, whose charm had once captivated millions. After his death in 2010, the house had changed hands several times, but it had never quite shed the whispers of its past. Evelyn, an up-and-coming actress, and Mark, a tech entrepreneur, saw the house as the perfect place to escape the grind of their busy lives and cultivate a quieter, more creative environment. The mansion was everything they dreamed of: lavish, spacious, with high ceilings, vintage furniture, and an undeniable sense of old Hollywood glamour. Yet, as soon as they moved in, things began to feel off. At first, it was subtle. Little things that didn't seem to make sense. A door left ajar when they were sure they had closed it. The faint sound of piano music drifting through the halls in the middle of the night, though they had no piano in the house. There were moments when Evelyn would find herself standing in front of a mirror, the reflection slightly warped, as if someone was standing behind her. Mark dismissed it as the house settling, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly alone. As days passed, the sensations grew more intense. One night, as they sat in the large living room, Evelyn noticed a shadow pass by the window, a fleeting figure. She went outside, convinced it was a neighbor or perhaps a trick of the light, but no one was there. Yet, she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that something, or someone, was watching them. Mark, who prided himself on his logical mind, tried to keep the peace by chalking up the odd occurrences to stress, but even he couldn't deny the occasional cold spot that lingered in certain rooms of the house. Things reached their breaking point one stormy evening when they decided to host a small dinner party with friends. As the guests settled into the dining room, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. The storm raged outside, but there was an eerie stillness inside the house. It wasn't until Mark went to check the circuit breakers that he felt the chilling presence. In the hallway just beyond the kitchen, he saw it, a figure. It was fleeting, but there was no mistaking the silhouette, a tall man with a distinct old-fashioned sense of style. Mark blinked, and when he opened his eyes, the figure was gone. The next day, Evelyn began researching the history of the house. She learned that Tony Curtis had lived in the mansion for many years, even after his career slowed down. The house was said to be a reflection of his eccentric personality, full of grandiose details and vintage Hollywood artifacts. But as Evelyn delved deeper, she uncovered a series of strange incidents that had occurred in the house over the years: accounts of other owners hearing odd noises, seeing figures in the mirrors, and feeling the unmistakable weight of someone or something watching them. Determined to understand the source of the haunting, Evelyn and Mark contacted a local historian who had studied the property. The historian revealed something unsettling. There had been rumors that Curtis had a secret obsession with the occult in his later years. Though no concrete evidence ever surfaced, the historian mentioned strange parties and gatherings at the house, mysterious late-night visitors, and unexplained events that seemed to coincide with Curtis' decline into reclusiveness. One night, as they explored the mansion, Evelyn and Mark discovered a hidden room behind a false wall in the study. The room was small, cramped, and filled with old photographs, handwritten letters, and personal artifacts that belonged to Curtis. At the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, which seemed out of place amid the dusty boxes and papers. As Evelyn gazed into it, she felt a cold, unnerving sensation sweep over her. The reflection of the room in the mirror was distorted, and she could have sworn she saw Tony Curtis standing behind her, his expression unreadable. The couple soon realized that the house was not merely haunted by the past of its famous owner. It was as if Curtis had never truly left. His energy, his presence, lingered in every corner, every shadow. The haunting wasn't malevolent, but it was impossible to ignore. They often felt an overwhelming sense of nostalgia, as though the house itself mourned the loss of its former glory. Evelyn and Mark eventually reached a decision. They couldn't live in the house any longer, not in the way they had hoped. The allure of its history and the charm of its old Hollywood elegance had faded, replaced by an unease they could no longer ignore. They sold the house to a new owner, but not before leaving behind a detailed account of their experiences, hoping that the next inhabitants would approach the house with the understanding that Tony Curtis was, in a way, still their part of the house, part of its legacy. The house now stands empty, its halls silent for the time being. But those who pass by say the faint sound of piano music can still be heard, drifting out into the night, a haunting reminder of the man who once lived there. And perhaps, just perhaps, a reminder that some things some spirits refuse to be forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Evelyn and Mark's departure from the house marked a turning point in the mansion's long and storied history. The new owners, a wealthy couple from New York, Sarah and Nathaniel, had heard whispers about the house's eerie reputation but were undeterred. Sarah, a successful art dealer, and Nathaniel, a real estate mogul, were fascinated by the idea of living in a place so rich with history, despite the rumors of hauntings. They viewed the house as a masterpiece, its walls steeped in the glamour of old Hollywood, a canvas for their own modern story. They had always longed for a residence that carried weight, something with character, something with soul, and Tony Curtis' former home was exactly what they sought. As they settled into the mansion, the initial excitement of living in such a storied place quickly gave way to an unsettling silence. Unlike Evelyn and Mark, Sarah and Nathaniel initially brushed off the oddities. After all, they reasoned, old houses often had their quirks: creaky floors, drafty windows, and the occasional inexplicable sound. It wasn't until they began spending more time in the house that the true nature of its haunting revealed itself, slowly at first, then with increasing frequency and intensity. It began with the light flickering in the grand hallway. Every time Nathaniel walked through, the chandelier would blink out for a fraction of a second, only to return to its full glow moments later. He dismissed it at first, thinking it was an issue with the electrical wiring. However, after a week of this peculiar behavior, he grew less certain. It was as if the lights responded to his presence, dimming, then flaring up again, as though something unseen was toying with him. He tried to fix it himself, replacing bulbs, checking the connections, but nothing seemed to work. His frustration grew, but Sarah, ever the optimist, suggested they simply call an electrician. She didn't believe in ghosts, at least not in the way they were being described. She chalked it up to the stress of moving into such a large, unfamiliar space. But as the days went on, Sarah began to experience things she couldn't explain away with reason. She was drawn to the large study, a room lined with bookshelves and old movie memorabilia. Tony Curtis had left behind countless photos of his films, his life, his adventures. They were mounted in ornate frames on the walls, as though frozen in time. One evening, while perusing a particular album filled with behind-the-scenes shots of Curtis on movie sets, Sarah heard a soft whisper, a word barely audible, but distinct. She froze, her heart racing. The whisper came again, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't coming from anywhere in particular, but the sound was undeniably close. It seemed to seep from the walls, as though the house itself was speaking. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She glanced nervously at the door, half expecting someone to be standing in the doorway, but the room was empty. The sensation was fleeting, a single moment that Sarah tried to dismiss, but it stayed with her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. It was as though the house had reached out and touched her, leaving behind a chill she couldn't shake. Meanwhile, Nathaniel had become obsessed with the large mirror in the living room, a striking piece that had once belonged to Tony Curtis himself. The mirror was framed in gold, its intricate design depicting scenes from Curtis movies, scenes that seemed to come to life when the light caught them just right. Nathaniel couldn't help but stand before it at odd hours of the night, mesmerized by his own reflection. At first, he assumed it was the allure of living in such a grand house that made him so captivated by the mirror. But soon it became more than that. The reflection seemed off. He began to notice that, on certain occasions, his own image in the mirror looked older than it should. His face more worn, more tired, as though the mirror was showing him a future that hadn't yet come to pass. One night, unable to sleep, Nathaniel stood before the mirror once again, studying the reflection. He saw his own face, drawn with fatigue, and then just as he blinked he saw something else. A shadow, tall and unmistakably male, stepped into the frame, standing just behind him. Nathaniel spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty, save for the faint flicker of candlelight that had been burning beside him on the table. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. His reflection, once again, was just his own, albeit more fatigued than before. The sense of dread that had been growing in him since their arrival now seemed inescapable. He wasn't sure if it was the house itself or something far more sinister, a force that had once held Tony Curtis captive in this mansion. But there was no denying it now. Someone was in the house with them. The final straw came one night, a week later, when Sarah was alone in the study, preparing for an upcoming exhibition. She had been working late into the evening, surrounded by stacks of art books and framed paintings, when she felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the air had become heavier, more oppressive. The lights flickered once again, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and grow along the walls. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, and at that moment, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of a piano, playing a melody she didn't recognize. The music echoed through the house, a haunting, melancholic tune that filled the empty space. It came from somewhere near the living room, but when Sarah stepped into the hall, the sound seemed to travel, pulling her in different directions. She walked cautiously through the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, the melody drawing her closer, until she found herself standing before the grand mirror in the living room. The music was louder now, almost deafening. But the house itself was empty. There were no signs of anyone having been there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned to the mirror. For a moment, she saw nothing but her own reflection, her wide, fearful eyes staring back at her. Then, slowly, the reflection shifted. In the glass, a figure appeared just behind her. The image was faint at first, but it grew clearer with each passing second. It was Tony Curtis, standing silently behind her, a solemn expression on his face. His eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, as if he were silently watching her every move. The music continued to play, and the air grew colder, the chill creeping up her spine. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure of Curtis slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at her. His gaze was intense, his presence overwhelming. And just as suddenly as it had started, the music ceased, and the figure of Tony Curtis vanished from the mirror, leaving Sarah standing alone in the empty room. Terrified and trembling, Sarah ran to find Nathaniel, telling him everything. But when they returned to the living room together, the mirror was empty, its surface reflecting only the room behind them. The air was still. The music was gone. But Sarah knew what she had seen. She knew that Tony Curtis had left an indelible mark on this house and on them. And now, they were trapped, bound to a place haunted by the echoes of a past that refused to die. The days following the event in the living room felt like a slow descent into madness for Sarah and Nathaniel. They could no longer ignore the presence that had settled over the house. It wasn't just the music or the occasional fleeting image in the mirror, it was a pervasive feeling, an oppressive weight that hung in the air, pressing in on them from all sides. It clung to the walls, to the furniture, to the very ground they walked on. The house was alive, but not in the way it had once been. It was haunted by the past, by the ghost of Tony Curtis and whatever had been left behind after his time there. That night, after the figure in the mirror had vanished, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay awake in the grand bedroom, the enormous four-poster bed feeling too large, too empty. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, seemed amplified in the silence. Her mind raced with the image of Curtis's face, his cold eyes watching her from the reflection. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to understand something she didn't. Nathaniel, too, was restless. He had tried to act the part of the rational man, the one who didn't believe in ghosts, but after that night, he couldn't deny the strange occurrences any longer. His thoughts kept returning to the mirror, his own reflection, the shifting face, and the figure that had appeared behind him. He had tried to make sense of it, but there was no explanation. No logical reasoning could account for what had happened. It was as if the house had taken a part of him, a part of them, and was holding it hostage. They spent the next several days researching the history of the house more thoroughly. They dug through archives, old Hollywood magazines, and records of Curtis's life, hoping to find some clue, some indication that they could resolve whatever force had latched onto them. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized the mansion had been a place of mystery and intrigue long before they had ever stepped foot inside. Tony Curtis had been a man of contrasts, charming and charismatic, yet deeply private in his later years. He had withdrawn from the public eye, retreating into the mansion with its sprawling gardens and hidden corners. It was said that he hosted eccentric gatherings, mysterious parties with guests who came and went under strange circumstances. The more Sarah and Nathaniel read, the more they learned about Curtis's infatuation with the supernatural. Rumors swirled that he had dabbled in the occult, experimenting with seances and rituals to try to summon spirits or communicate with the dead. The mansion itself had become his sanctuary, but also, perhaps, his prison. They found a journal entry from one of Curtis's late-night musings, where he spoke of a feeling, a sense of being watched, of being followed by an unseen presence. He described strange dreams, of being trapped in a place between the living and the dead, of hearing music in the night that had no source. The entry ended abruptly, as though Curtis had been interrupted. It was the last entry in the journal, dated just a week before his death. That night, as Sarah lay in bed once again, she heard the faint, melancholic tune of a piano drifting through the house. She sat up, her heart racing, knowing now that there was no denying it. It was the same music, the same eerie melody that had filled the house when she had encountered Curtis's reflection. She rose from the bed and crept down the hallway, the sound growing louder with every step. Came from the living room. Nathaniel followed, his face pale, the unease written in every line of his features. Together, they entered the room, the grand mirror standing before them, reflecting the dim light of the candles they had lit. The piano music continued to play, the notes haunting, sad, and distant. Sarah and Nathaniel stood frozen in place, unable to move, as the air grew colder around them. Then, as if by some unseen force, the mirror began to change. The reflection shifted, distorting as though it were made of liquid. The furniture in the room seemed to blur, and the space between them and the mirror grew thicker, like an invisible barrier. And then there he was, Tony Curtis. He stood before them in the reflection, his face just as Sarah had seen it in the living room, his eyes locking onto hers. But this time he was different. His expression wasn't solemn. It was searching, almost pleading. His mouth opened, as though he was trying to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, the music grew louder, louder than ever before, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Sarah felt a cold hand on her shoulder, Nathaniel's hand. She realized, but it was as if he had become an extension of the chill that had overtaken the room. His grip was tight, as though he were holding on for dear life. "Sarah, we need to leave." Nathaniel's voice was hoarse, desperate. He tried to pull her away, but Sarah was frozen, her gaze locked on the figure in the mirror. Curtis's eyes seemed to beg her, silently, for something she couldn't understand. And then, as quickly as it had all started, the reflection changed again. This time it wasn't Curtis. It was the room as it had been, empty save for the mirror itself. The music stopped abruptly, the silence crashing down on them like a tidal wave. Sarah and Nathaniel stood in the living room, trembling, unsure if what they had seen had been real or just some twisted figment of their imagination. The weight in the air, the oppressive feeling that had been with them for days, lifted slightly, but it didn't go away entirely. They left the house soon after that. It wasn't a decision they made lightly. Despite their wealth and success, they could not live in a place where they were constantly being watched, where the past held such a grip on their every waking moment. The mansion, despite its beauty and grandeur, had become a prison, a monument to a life that had left its mark in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. When the house was sold once more, to yet another new owner, the story of Tony Curtis's haunted mansion faded into the shadows, like the soft echoes of piano music drifting out into the night. But there were those who passed by, who felt the same unease, the same whispers of something lost within those walls. And for some, it was enough to know that the spirit of Tony Curtis, with his charm and his secrets, had never truly left. His mansion, his sanctuary, remained a place where the past could never be fully erased. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.